This is Stark. In this video we are looking at the religious settlement under Elizabeth I. So first of all we need to look at Elizabeth's religious views, as it is hard to work out exactly what Elizabeth's religious views were because she was particularly conscious of the impression she made to others. So this meant that she ensured that she didn't just advocate one point of view. Elizabeth also wanted to heal the divisions between the Catholics and the Protestants and maximise her control over the church, rather than create something that reflected her personal theology. However, there are clues to show that Elizabeth was a Protestant, so her mother, for example, Anne Boleyn, was sympathetic to Protestant reform. Her education had been conducted by teachers like Sir Roger Ascham, who had been knowledgeable about Lutheran ideas. She forbade priests in the royal chapel to elevate the host, and this represented transubstantiation. And she was apparently furious when the Dean of St Paul's Cathedral presented her with a prayer book which contained illustrations of saints. However, there were other aspects of Catholicism that were appealing to Elizabeth. So for example, she enjoyed some aspects of the Catholic Church, like the crucifix and the candles, and she supported the traditional view that priests should devote their lives to God and not marry. So one of the first priorities of Elizabeth's new government was the religion, and elsewhere in Europe wars were common over religion, and Elizabeth was determined to establish a stable church that most people could accept. But the two aspects to choose the religious stance of the country were the legal status of the church and the liturgical books to be used in church services. And there was no doubt that the relationship between Rome and the English church would be severed, and instead the Church of England would be reinstated with the monarch at the head. But the more contentious issue would be the nature of the established church, and there were three main different options. The first one was an Anglo-Catholic church, and this was the doctrines remained Catholic, yet they had rejected papal supremacy. The next idea was a moderate Protestant church, and that's similar to what was implied in the Act of Uniformity of 1549, which I'll talk about in my Edward VI religious reform video, or an evangelical church, and this was similar to that implied in the more Protestant Act of Uniformity of 1552. But the Elizabethan settlement led to two Acts of Parliament, royal injunctions used to enforce the Act, and the publication of a new Book of Common Prayer. The 39 Articles of Religion were also introduced in 1563. But first, let's look at the influences on the religious settlement, as there were both domestic and foreign influences. And the domestic influences we'll start with first, as there was a mixture of both Protestants and Catholics in England, and Elizabeth issued a royal proclamation in December 1558, insisting that there should be no preaching. There were also many Catholic bishops in Parliament and many Catholic noblemen who formed a solid Catholic voting bloc. So this meant that they objected to the attempt to bring back the Protestant prayer book of 1552 and the prospect of a church being headed by a woman. Now, whilst London were in favour of a Protestant settlement, opinion elsewhere was more sceptical, and the north of England remained conservative. However, the religious settlement became easier to pass when Elizabeth imprisoned two Catholic bishops for suggesting that they didn't accept Elizabeth's authority over them, and this was during a government-sponsored debate between Protestant and Catholic clergy. Now, there was also many foreign influences. So for example, England was still at war with France, and they were unable to rely on the support from Spain and Scotland, as Scotland were allied with France, and their young queen, Mary Queen of Scots, was next in line to the English throne. So this meant that Elizabeth had to be careful. So the settlement was made easier when the Peace of Cateau-cambresis was signed in Easter 1559. And this brought a series of wars between France and Spain to an end and ended English military involvement in France. So this meant that when Parliament reassembled after Easter, it was easier to pass legislation through. Now, after Elizabeth had made some concessions over her title and the wording of the prayer book and put considerable pressure on noble members to back her, she was able to gain a majority of one vote. So now let's look at the Act of Supremacy of 1559. And this act restored in law the royal supremacy in the Church, which had been established under Henry VIII, yet repealed under Mary I. And this meant that the Reformation legislation of Henry VIII's reign was restored, the heresy law under Mary I was repealed, the papal supremacy, which had been restored under statute law under Mary I, was repealed. The Act described Elizabeth as the supreme governor of the Church, and this was rather than the head, and this may have been a concession to Catholicism or a representation of the misogynist views within England and the Church. All churchmen had to swear an oath of loyalty to their new supreme governor, and the Court of High Commission was set up to investigate those who refused to accept the change of leadership, and ultimately the Act restored the legal position of the Crown in Henry VIII's reign, and this gave legislative authority to the Crown to act in matters relating to the Church. In the same year, Elizabeth also passed the Act of Uniformity, and this act specified that there would be a single Book of Common Prayer, and this would be a modified version of a strongly Protestant book written by Cranmer in 1552. And the main modification was that variations in Eucharistic belief were allowed, and even Stephen Gardiner, who was the Catholic bishop before his death, thought that this was acceptable. So the ornaments of the church were restored to what they had been before 1549, and this meant that the altar was replaced by the more Protestant communion table, yet Catholic artefacts were able to be placed upon it. The Act also set out what priests should wear during services, and seeing as Protestants were more bothered by the words spoken, and Catholics would have found changes to the appearance of the church extremely hard to cope with, the church kept a fairly Catholic appearance. And this did aggravate certain Calvinist clergy who saw the ornaments as popish and objected to them. So to make sure that there was uniformity of worship, attendance at church was made compulsory, and failure to attend could result in a fine of 12 pence, with the money going to the poor. Attendance to the Catholic Mass, however, rather than the communion service of the Church of England, was treated as a serious offence and could warrant death. But the Act of Uniformity was not popular with everybody, and it was only passed in the House of Lords by 3 votes. So the next thing to look at is the Royal Injunctions of 1559, and as it was impossible to set out all the regulations governing the Reformed faith in a single Act of Parliament, a set of Royal Injunctions were issued in July 1559, and Cecil also nominated strong Protestants to enforce these injunctions, and there were 57 injunctions, which included some rules which I'll go through now. So the first injunction made clear the Protestant character, as it emphasised the suppression of superstition and the need to eradicate all hypocrisy and abuses. The Eucharist was to be administered at a simple communion table rather than at the altar, but the altars were not to be destroyed. Parish churches were required to purchase an English Bible as well as a copy of paraphrases by Erasmus. Prospective wives of clergy had to produce a certificate signed by 2 JPs signifying their fitness for such a role. Preachers had to be licensed by a bishop before they could begin preaching. Preachers also had to preach at least 1 service every month to keep their license, and pilgrimages were to be outlawed. So now let's look at the 1559 prayer book, and the 1559 prayer book amalgamated the moderate language of the 1549 prayer book with the strong Protestantism of the 1552 prayer book. And it had the aim of ending the quarrels between Catholics and Protestants, and it was able to act as a compromise between the two. So one of the main things the 1559 prayer book did was strike a balance on the meaning of the bread and wine. And Catholics believed that the priest transformed the bread into Christ's body and the wine into Christ's blood, and that those who consume them would be taking Christ's body directly. Whereas Protestants believed that the bread and wine were just symbolic of Christ's body and blood. But the 1559 prayer book allowed for the real belief of Christ in the Eucharist and removed an offensive prayer against the Pope. So in the following years after the religious settlement, the Convocation of Church set out the task of defining the identity of a church, and the result was the 39 Articles of Faith of 1563, which was made law in 1571. And like other parts of the settlement, it wielded together aspects of Catholicism and Protestantism. It was mainly Protestant though, as many aspects of Catholicism were condemned. So finally, we need to look at the reaction to the settlement at home. And Elizabeth had hoped that the settlement would calm down tensions between the Protestants and Catholics and avoid the religious warfare that was occurring in Europe. And it was estimated that around 400 of the clergy lost or resigned their livings because they would not accept the settlement. Now, virtually all of the bishops that Mary appointed rejected the settlement as well. But this did have benefits for Elizabeth, however, because she was able to make new appointments to people who were enthusiastic about her reforms, and the contrast between the 800 Protestants who fled during Mary's reign is also minimal. However, there was opposition to the settlement at a local level, and some ministers decided to ignore the new Book of Common Prayer, whilst a report from JPs showed that only half of them could be relied upon to actively support the settlement. There was even more discussed at the Act of Exchange, which happened in 1559, and this was significant opposition to the financial side of a settlement. And like Henry VIII, Elizabeth took money that was traditionally paid to Rome and kept it herself. But the most controversial policy was the Act of Exchange in 1559, and in the Act of Exchange, the Queen was allowed to take land and buildings from the church and force bishops to pay rent. Now, as well as increasing crown lands and revenues, the act was particularly used in order to keep bishops, especially those who were critical of the settlement, in line. So thank you for watching this video. This is all about Elizabeth's religious settlement, which is extremely important for the rest of her reign and led to many of the issues she had with religion, but also was a stroke of genius as it was a compromise between the two religions. So thank you and see you soon. Bye.